But what on earth does that mean?
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
And nobody understands it either. But if you want to learn the truth about the Inquisition, then stick around. It seems like some people, organizations, and governments are hell-bent on bringing down the Catholic Church. The question is, how do you expose opposition to the faith and to the truth? And while they say what you don't know can't hurt you, everybody needs to know about the hidden forces prowling around the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Guess that's where we come in. Follow me. Hello and welcome to this latest edition of CIA, the Catholic Investigative Agency. I'm Michael Voris. In this episode, we're going to take a close look at one of the most popular arguments people make against the Catholic Church. Have you ever been talking to a coworker, a friend, or a family member, trying to share your Catholic faith with them, and then they say something like, well, look at the Inquisition. It forced thousands of people to convert or die. But is that true? Was the Inquisition really as malicious as everybody says it was? And if it wasn't, then where did all the lies and myths come from? Well, guess what? It's time to debunk the myth that the Inquisition used extreme methods of torture to force all non-Catholics to convert to Catholicism or be burned alive at the stake. There's a whole spectrum of confusion about the Inquisition, from serious academic critique to the comedy of the well-known British troupe Monty Python that you saw earlier. Let's listen to what the man on the street knows about the Inquisition.
Basically went about and persecuting anybody that didn't believe specifically what the Catholic Church taught, and found people, there were Muslims and Jews living in Spain at the time, and they either gave them the choice to convert or be put to death, usually.
What do you know about the Inquisition?
Which one?
Whatever ones you know about, you can tell me about.
Spanish Inquisition? I believe that was when the Catholics killed everyone that wasn't Catholic.
They were religious people, and basically they were torturing them if they weren't the right religion, if they weren't Catholic. So anything outside of Catholicism, they were tortured for being.
Nothing about the Inquisition.
Well, as you heard, none of them really knew anything about the Inquisition, so let's look at our thesis as we begin to set the record straight. The Inquisitions were instituted to protect both guilty and innocent people from the gross injustice of secular leaders and mob rule, thus initiating an unprecedented level of justice and order throughout much of Europe. So, before we dig into the specifics, we need to lay out a few of the fundamental facts about the Inquisitions. First, the idea of the court of Inquisition. A court inquiring into a certain matter is not a Catholic one. Courts of Inquisition had been held by secular rulers for a long time, and Protestants had their own anti-Catholic inquisitions as well. Although the name Inquisition may not have been used, it was the same thing. The Catholic Inquisitions existed in many places in medieval and early modern Europe. However, there was never one massive, all-inclusive, pan-European Inquisition. The Inquisitions, plural, were localized circuit courts with the inquisitors traveling around from place to place. Another very important thing to understand about the Inquisitions is that they always started in response to a problem among the church and the faithful. A cleric or king would call for an inquisition because the situation was simply out of hand, and it needed the formalized order of an inquisition in order to be resolved. Unfortunately, the secular rulers would sometimes appropriate the ecclesiastical courts to further their own disingenuous goals. The last general point we'll make here has to do with the most prevalent lie about the Inquisitions, which is that they forced millions of people to convert to Catholicism or be put to death. The fact is that a minute fraction of people were tried and executed. Most people were found innocent. For example, did you know that such intellectual and holy giants of the Catholic Church as St. Teresa of Avila, St. Ignatius of Loyola, and St. John of the Cross were all brought before the Inquisition? Obviously, they were all found to be innocent of heresy and allowed to go free. But that's the point. They were brought to an orderly trial without torture, the evidence was heard, and they were found to be innocent and then set free. The flip side to this is that some Inquisition officials were unjust and cruel and wrongly punished both innocent and guilty people. But we have to understand, while the Catholic Church is a divine institution founded by Jesus Christ, it's made up of weak, sinful human beings who don't always do the will of God, and some have done very bad things. The problem is that the critics of the church will shine a spotlight on those individuals in the church who have done bad things, and then make the argument that the entire church is bad because of the actions of some, usually a few. And this is wholly unjust. It's like having someone who's a criminal in your family and your neighbors then saying that everybody in your family is a criminal. We're not here to say that the Inquisitions were without blame, but what we're going to show is that, by and large, the courts of the Inquisition were the most just and humane legal systems that existed anywhere in Europe at the time. And they were started to protect people from unjust treatment, not to harm them with unjust rulings. All right, so let's bust some of the more prevalent myths. The history of the different Inquisitions comprises over 600 years of convoluted and nuanced detail and events, but we'll try to break everything down as best we can in this short amount of time. To start with, there were three major Inquisitions: the Medieval Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition began when the Holy Office was set up in Rome to deal with the Protestant heresy in the 16th century. We're not going to spend much time on it here because when most people talk about the Inquisition, they're really talking about some confused mix of the first two. The Medieval Inquisition began in 1184 when Pope Lucius III sent a list of heresies to all the bishops in Europe, telling them to oversee the judgment of accused heretics. Thus, the initial courts of Inquisition were conducted by the bishop of a particular diocese. There was no centralized governance. At the time, the secular courts had been harshly and somewhat indiscriminately punishing people they believed to be a threat. Pope Lucius recognized that the accused needed to be protected from individual lords and even mobs. These lynch mobs were a significant problem. One example is of a man who was preaching the Cathar heresy, and he made a bonfire and started preaching beside the bonfire. When he threw a crucifix into the fire and started preaching against our Lord, the people listening rushed him and threw him into the fire. This sort of thing was quite common, and without institutionalizing the Inquisition, this type of behavior would have been allowed to run rampant for who knows how long. Catharism, by the way, is one of the very vaguely Gnostic heresies that sprang up in medieval Europe. The Cathars believed in a dualistic creation. They believed that God had created the soul, which was good, but the devil had created and ruled the physical realm, including our bodies, from which our souls had become trapped and needed to escape. Many people were very angry at these heretics, but it might be a bit hard for us to understand why, as we live in this modern age. In a September 2003 Crisis magazine article, renowned St. Louis University professor and Catholic apologetic Thomas Madden wrote a top-quality explanation of the Inquisitions. At one point, he explains the cultural milieu that would cause someone to feel justified in burning a fellow human being.
For medieval people, religion was not something one just did at church. It was their science, their philosophy, their politics, their identity, and their hope for salvation. It was not a personal preference, but an abiding and universal truth. Heresy, then, struck at the heart of that truth. It doomed the heretic, endangered those near him, and tore apart the fabric of community.
See, back then, religion wasn't just a personal preference for people. It was real and it mattered. It wasn't something people got involved in to feel good about themselves. It was a way of life. And if something came along to threaten that way of life, it had to be eradicated before it created chaos. Unfortunately, the common people often took the law into their own hands, usually ending in grievous violence and bloodshed, and often the killing of the wrong person anyway. By the 13th century, the violence against the Cathars had grown so bad that in 1231, Pope Gregory IX decided that he had to centralize the authority of all the individual inquisitions in his papal authority at Rome. The Holy Father normalized the Inquisitions by making the Dominicans the official inquisitors and making the Inquisitions answerable to him. The Dominicans had been specially trained in canon law and theology, so they were uniquely suited to handle the Inquisitions. Highly detailed manuals were also printed up and dispersed, which defined how an inquisition was to be conducted. Now stop and think about the situation for a minute. There are bands of angry people roving about Central Europe looking for someone to burn. They start burning supposed heretics because the kings and nobles are all doing the same thing, and they think they have church approval to do this. Finally, Pope Gregory realizes that the church is the only one who can put a stop to this, so he sets up a new court system that is based on Catholic morality. Through the courts of the Inquisition, the Holy Father is trying to ensure everyone will receive respect and justice. Now that doesn't really sound like a sadistic monster relishing the abominable torture of innocent people now, does it? So keep in mind that medieval European law was practically one and the same with church law, and the United States inherited bits and pieces of this legal code when the Founding Fathers used English common law as the basis for the American legal system. To find out more about the Inquisition, we sat down in our RealCatholicTV.com studios and interviewed Canadian author and TV show host Michael Korn about his book, Why Catholics Are Right, a splendid book, by the way. On our interview program, The Roman Forum, Mr. Korn weighed in with a brief overview of the Inquisition. Have a listen.
The Inquisition, look, again, I'm not saying it was wonderful, but the average person saw the Inquisition once every 30 years. There were criminals who would blaspheme, so they could go before the Inquisition rather than a criminal court, because at the Inquisition you had a legal defense. I don't want to tread on toes here, but you had more rights at the Inquisition than you do in Guantanamo Bay. However, let's put that one aside.
So what he's basically saying is that the courts of the Inquisition were way ahead of their time as far as justice and fairness are concerned, but a lot of people try to claim just the opposite. There are many individuals who adamantly argue that the Inquisitions were institutions of unique atrocities and sadistic cruelties perpetrated by hooded and drooling clerics. Garbage like this is just that, garbage. Let's take an example. One of the reasons people give for why the Inquisition is so bad is that when a person was accused of heresy, he wasn't allowed to know who his accuser was. But the person who makes this assertion has no knowledge of the context. It's true that the accusers' names were usually kept secret. This was done because there had been times when the accuser and his family were threatened or even killed for reporting someone to the Inquisition. However, the court balanced this out by letting the accused person produce a list of all his known enemies. Then the court would investigate to see if any of these people had falsely accused the defendant. If the accuser was on the defendant's listed enemies, the court would take his accusation with a huge grain of salt. Inquisition courts also took a very dim view of false witnesses. If someone lied during an investigation, they risked severe punishment for themselves and even death. Besides the process of accusation, there's something else that a lot of people like to get their pants in a knot over, although, like usual, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. People become livid over the Inquisitions as they indignantly, read ignorantly, denounce the inquisitors' supposed practice of slinking around, forcing non-Catholics to convert or die. Again, this is a load of hogwash. The courts of the Inquisition were set up by the Catholic Church to inquire into whether members of the church were properly living out their faith. The courts were also trying people for other grave sins like adultery and fornication, severe blasphemy, and immorality among the clergy. Honestly now, does it make sense that the church would tell another Catholic to convert or die? Clearly, that's not the case. The idea that inquisitors went prowling around Europe, raping women and children as they wrenched conversions out of humble non-Catholics, it's utterly ludicrous. Remember, the Inquisitions weren't perfect, but the express intent and duty of the courts was to provide people with objective justice and fairness. And most of the time, the courts succeeded in holding to a legal standard much higher than anywhere else in the world. Even today, injustice exists in our own court systems, and juries are rigged, judges are taking bribes, bad lawyers provide bad defenses, bad criminals get off on technicalities, etc. Despite all these injustices, no one would sanely stand up and say the whole system is bad and all the people who work in modern courts are crooks and thieves. So what really went on in the Inquisitions? In his book, Why Catholics Are Right, once again, Michael Koren spends some time talking about what the Inquisitions were like, how they were run, and what their real goals were. He explains how a court of Inquisition would have priests stay in a town or a village for a month or so, preaching and teaching and hearing confessions. This was called the period of grace. Anyone who wanted to confess and be forgiven during this period could do so. If the people accused of heresy repented, that was the end of the matter. If they did not, they would be tried, and if found guilty, the Inquisition officials would decide on the method of punishment. Incidentally, most people were not burned at the stake. Common punishments included being required to perform certain good works, such as helping build a church, visiting a church, going on a pilgrimage, or even participating in a crusade, all far cries from being lit up. Stricter punishments could be fines, whippings with rods, the pillory, and wearing colored crosses. A guilty person might also be imprisoned or excommunicated, in which case they would then be handed over to the secular authorities. See, the Inquisitions didn't exactly execute people. If someone's sentence was quite serious, they would be excommunicated, and then punishment was up to the civil courts. In those days, civil and canon law were pretty much united to better serve justice and protect the individual from abuse. Remember, back then, our very modern and recent ideas about the separation of church and state didn't exist at all. Now, although these things are important to understand, we have yet to deal with the most pernicious set of lies. By far, the most serious misconception is that the Inquisition hideously tortured, maimed, and murdered tens of thousands of people merely because the church was trying to force them to become Catholic. This is outrageous. Yes, the courts did sometimes use torture, just like our U.S. government uses torture, or, enhanced interrogation techniques, to obtain desired information. Anyone ever hear of waterboarding? Anyway, what modern man has to understand is that torture was not used as a form of punishment, but for getting at the truth. Inquisitors were keenly sensitive to the need for ironclad proof of an individual's guilt or innocence, and eyewitnesses were considered one of the best ways of securing such proof. But if that proof wasn't easily obtainable, the inquisitors would have to resort to other means of proof. Very infrequently, that meant the defendant and sometimes even the witnesses were tortured for a short period, not to exceed 15 minutes. That was the rule, not to exceed 15 minutes to make sure the inquisitors made the correct judgment. Although it was sometimes ignored, the rule was that no one was allowed to be tortured more than once, and the type of torture could not cause maiming or death or even the risk of death. Incidentally, this may sound very familiar to the U.S. government's practice of waterboarding, which is still highly debated in the United States. So it seems a little disingenuous for modern man to accuse the Catholic Church of unspeakable, heinous practices when similar practices occur today and are still being debated. You need to remember that torture existed long before the courts of the Inquisition, and the Church was always leery about allowing it at all. Pope Innocent IV was the first to allow the use of torture in Inquisition trials. He made the concession in his bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252. Torture was used as a last resort when guilt seemed probable, but there was no other way of being certain of the truth. But many judges recognized that innocent people would sometimes confess to things they didn't do while being tortured just so the pain would end. So a lot of the judges would not attach a heck of a lot of weight to the testimony received under torture. In his 2003 Crisis Magazine article, Professor Thomas Madden gives some specifics of how torture was handled, specifics that obviously blow anti-Catholics' false conceptions of the Inquisitions right out of the intellectual cesspool they like to wallow in. Let's take a listen.
Modern researchers have discovered that the Spanish Inquisition applied torture in only 2% of its cases. Each instance of torture was limited to a maximum of 15 minutes. In only 1% of the cases was torture applied twice, and never for a third time.
Torture was only used in 2% of cases, and yet somehow the only thing the people in our man-on-the-street interviews could tell us was that the Inquisition tortured and killed people. How ridiculous. And ignorance and stupidity of this magnitude can only be chalked up to deliberate lies and deceit on the part of those who hate the Church and want to destroy her. Speaking of modern myths and lies about the Inquisition, remember the Monty Python sketch we opened with? Unfortunately, it's always been in vogue to mock the church and the Spanish Inquisition. But jokes like these are very hurtful because many people form their opinions of the Inquisition based on these fairy tales. To show you what we mean, let's check out another man-on-the-street interview with a young fellow whose sole knowledge of the Inquisition comes from Monty Python.
Like the Spanish Inquisition?
Sure.
It was like a long time ago, and a bunch of Spanish people would like torture people to get, I don't know where, I mean, I know they have a Monty Python sketch. It's pretty funny.
Pretty sad, huh? See, the problem is that almost everything people know about the Inquisition and don't know is a convoluted mess of myths and lies. Now stop and think about all of this for a minute. What many people have done is form a radically biased opinion about the Catholic Church, and consequently her teachings, based on ridiculous accusations about the Inquisition, while knowing next to nothing about the facts of the Inquisition. To better understand all of this, we need to take a look at some history to really see why the Inquisitions were seen as necessary and why they operated like they did. When people mention the word Inquisition, they're almost always talking about the Spanish Inquisition. This is probably the most complicated of the three, but it's also the one that needs the most explanation. Now, if you remember from earlier, we talked about the Cathar heresy and how it provided much of the impetus for the institutionalizing of the Inquisition. In the 13th century, there was a great deal of fighting between the Cathars and the Catholic laity who couldn't stand the heretics. Eventually, King James I of Aragon asked Pope Gregory IX to institute an Inquisition there to stop the violence by providing the Cathars with a due process of law. The Pope acquiesced with the decree of his bull Declinante Iam Mundi that he issued on May 26, 1232. Technically, this was the start of the Spanish Inquisition, but it reached its maturity when King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I assumed the throne over 200 years later. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a bull giving Ferdinand and Isabella the permission to establish an Inquisition in Spain. It was run by priests, but the king and queen maintained ultimate control over the court. The first two inquisitors were unscrupulous men, so in the mid-1480s, Ferdinand asked Fray Tomás de Torquemada to step in and become the Grand Inquisitor. He's the priest who's popularly thought to be the devil incarnate leader of a sadistic cult founded on the idea that torture is good and more torture is even better. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. He had a lot more power than most inquisitors, yes, and he was much more thorough, yes, but he rarely used torture. He also worked incredibly hard to make sure that everyone received justice. Okay, so before we go on, we need to backpedal a little bit and explain the background and the lead-up to the institution of the Spanish Inquisition. Remember that the first Inquisitions were started in Central and Western Europe to address the problems surrounding the Cathar heresy. This time, in the 15th century of Spain, the Inquisition was instituted to look into the matter of the conversos, or Jewish and Muslim converts to Catholicism. The point is, none of the Inquisitions were arbitrarily just started up to round people up and force-feed them the Catholic faith or barbecue them. Inquisitions were always begun in response to a specific problem that was being very poorly handled. You see, throughout the entirety of the medieval and early modern Europe, there was a vibrant and vicious anti-Semitism. England and France had expelled all of the Jews in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and many people in Spain were resentful and distrustful of the Jews, and sometimes formed mobs to attack the Jews and force them to convert or die. Many converted, but their conversions were regarded with suspicion because they'd been done under force. These forced conversions were neither handled nor endorsed by the Catholic Church, and yet today, that's the impetus for them. The impetus for them is laid solely at the feet of the Church. Now, by the time Ferdinand and Isabella took power, the original conversos had been dead for centuries, and their descendants were ethnically and culturally Jewish, but at the same time devout Catholics. There were also still a lot of Jews and Muslims in Spain as well. Because they were Catholic, these conversos were able to own land and business and began to amass wealth. Unfortunately, they also gained the envy and resentment of the so-called pure Catholics in Spain. People began to spread rumors that the conversos were part of a huge Jewish plot to infiltrate and destroy the nobility and the church. Accusations began to swirl and escalate until the king and queen finally asked Pope Sixtus IV to allow the crown to set up an inquisition in Spain, which he did, as we said, in 1478. The court almost immediately became submerged under a deluge of accusations against the conversos. In his interview, Michael Koren also talked about the unstable environment in Spain at this time.
So the Inquisition, it was about nationalism. Spain, there were dozens of Inquisitions. Nothing much happened. It's the Spanish Inquisition people talk about. Spain was a new nation state, besieged on all sides. It was nervous about would it exist in the future, so it required to be a Spaniard, you had to be a Catholic. Problem. It shouldn't have been, and so Jews and Muslims were told convert or leave. Many converted, and they weren't really Christian. There were volumes of laws that had to be applied if you were taken to the Inquisition. I'm not saying it was the right thing, but compared to the rest of the world, it was actually rather civilized.
So because of all the fear and unrest at the time in Spain, Spain decided independently of the Catholic Church, and that's important, independently of the Catholic Church, that the Inquisition would be the tool used to ensure the loyalty of the conversos to the state. Remember, Spain and Portugal had just recently kicked the Muslim forces out of the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista, but there were still lots of Muslims and Muslim converts to Catholicism living in Spain. The Spanish were suspicious of these Muslims, as well as of the large Jewish population, because sometimes the Jews had fought with the Muslims against the Catholics, and this had endangered the stability of the Spanish state. What you see here, then, is that the Inquisition was used by the state, Ferdinand and Isabella, to promote Spanish loyalty through the religion of the state. Interestingly, though, even in the heyday of the supposedly dreadful Spanish Inquisition, there was only a fraction of the executions all those modern uninformed intellectuals tell us there were. Here's the point. The peak of the Spanish Inquisition was during Queen Isabella's 30-year reign, from 1474 to 1504, and Torquemada's time as Grand Inquisitor mostly coincided with Queen Isabella's reign. So, under Isabella's rule, about 15,000 people were convicted of heresy, but repented and were accepted back into the church. Unfortunately, about 2,000 people were convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. Now, are we saying that those 2,000 people don't matter? No. Are we saying that it's okay to burn people who teach lies? No. What we are saying is that the lies you'll hear from your ignorant, run-of-the-mill anti-Catholics are completely unsubstantiated by the facts of the matter. So, here's some quick statistics we made using those same numbers. Under Queen Isabella, 12% of the people convicted, not the people tried, but the people convicted, were burned at the stake. The other 88% of the people convicted of heresy repented and were sent away free. These numbers prove that the Inquisition officials weren't bloodthirsty devils who were craving violence and death and torture. What the percentages show is that the Spanish Inquisition was much more interested in getting Catholics to live out their faith than in killing them. And you have to remember, life in the 15th century was filled with uncertainties regarding personal safety, political upheaval, and just having enough food to feed your family. People were trying to survive in a period of time fraught with ignorance, deprivation, and fear of conquest. That's important, fear of conquest. And although the courts of the Inquisition helped hold some of that danger back, the Inquisition officials were still affected by their culture and society, which had a very black and white understanding of survival and justice. Let's listen again to Michael Koren as he talks about the relationship between the Church and the European society that the Church had helped to build. He explains why people who belong to the divinely founded Catholic Church sometimes still do very bad things.
The Church has been at its worst when it's most resembled the culture, when it's given in, when it's changed with the times.
Here's the point. The Inquisition officials and state rulers were violent, but this begs the question, are we any less violent today? Back in the Middle Ages, violence was common, and people often settled disagreements by killing each other, and sometimes with little cause, according to modern-day standards. This was the prevailing attitude of both monarchs and the common folk. In the 20th and 21st centuries, however, there is just as much a violent approach among leaders and common people as there was 600 years ago. Communist regimes, for example, executed over 100 million of their own citizens, and still counting, and in the West, hundreds of millions of people have been killed through abortion and euthanasia. The question can fairly be asked, are we really that much more advanced than those who abused their Inquisition powers? We could actually be looking back to the Inquisitions as models of restraint and how to mete out justice. Now, in case these comparisons seem a bit far removed, let's look at some much more proximate examples to the Inquisition. Something a lot of people don't know is that while the Catholic Inquisitions were going on, there were also many Protestant Inquisitions, although they didn't use that name, that they hunted down and killed anyone who wouldn't convert to Protestantism by turning away from the Catholic Church. A far different story than the Catholic Inquisitions. These happened after the Protestant rebellion in some of the German and Low Countries. There were also inquisitions in England under King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, his daughter. After Henry made himself the supreme head of the church in England and started forcing everyone to convert to Anglicanism, a lot of his subjects refused. So Henry simply taxed them or took all of their property and killed them. It was like the Catholic Inquisitions on steroids. Even after Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, took the throne, there were still a great many Catholics secretly practicing their faith. So Elizabeth commanded her soldiers to seek out, arrest, torture, and butcher the Catholics for such minor offenses as attending Mass, hiding a priest, or refusing to attend Protestant services. Here's Michael Korn again to give us a little better idea of the religious tolerance that Catholics got from Good Queen Bess.
In England, Good Queen Bess, is always on TV these days, being played by some actress or other. She was hanging, drawing, and quartering people. I won't go into the details here, people might be eating their dinner, but hanging, drawing, and quartering innocent people simply because they were Catholic. There was no Inquisition in Central Europe. The 30 Years' War, the first example of total warfare. Villages wiped out, hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered.
You see, thousands of Catholic bishops, priests, nuns, and laymen were tortured and killed because they did not profess England's state religion. These people were hunted down and dragged before the Protestant courts to be tried for heresy. The only thing that was their crimes of heresy were that they believed in the Catholic faith and refused to follow Henry's man-made religion. There are a great many English martyrs, at least a few of their names should be familiar to you. Veritable giants of the faith, like St. Sir Thomas More, who refused to trample on his faith for Henry VIII's nonsense, and St. Edmund Campion, a young priest who brought the sacraments to his spiritual children until he was finally apprehended and slaughtered. So let's think about this for a second. Henry and Elizabeth told all non-Anglicans to convert or die. The Catholic Inquisition told other Catholics that if they were going to call themselves Catholic, they just had to live out their faith. And yet, as the myth goes, Catholics are the evil ones, and Queen Elizabeth will forever be remembered as Good Queen Bess. This makes absolutely no sense, and it's the result of the same propaganda that made the Spanish Inquisition be remembered as infamous. All right, so now we know that the popular ideas about the Inquisition have little or nothing to do with reality, but where did all these lies come from? Well, they came from several different sources. The first people who spread lies about the Inquisition were other European countries. Think about it. Spain's Inquisition began in 1478. Just 14 years later, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, who was sponsored by Isabella and Ferdinand, discovered the New World that was rich with all sorts of treasures. As the 16th century dawned, Spain entered her golden age, a period of great wealth, influence, prosperity, and military power. All of the surrounding countries who had similar desires of conquering the New World and advancing their kingdoms were both really jealous and really fearful of Spain's rise to power. So the newly minted Protestant countries of Germany and England, who'd been less than 100 years old at this point, helped by the printing press, began to wage a propaganda war against Spain and thus created the Black Legend. The Black Legend is a set of myths basically saying that the Spanish were a superstitious people still stuck in what is sometimes erroneously called the Dark Ages. On his website, dedicated to the promotion of the Catholic faith, musician and apologist David MacDonald presents an in-depth analysis of the Inquisitions. At one point, he explains how the Black Legend was developed and promoted. Listen to this.
Two important Protestant publications in it were John Fox's Book of Martyrs and a leaflet published in 1567 penned by a supposed Inquisition victim named Montanus. He painted Catholic Spaniards as barbarians who ravished women and sodomized young boys. The propagandists soon created
hooded fiends who tortured their victims in horrible devices like the knife-filled Iron Maiden. The number of victims was exaggerated. Fox claimed 32,000 were burned at the stake. The myth became the accepted stereotype, as seen in Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor in The Brothers Karamazov, and in Edgar Allan Poe's Tale of the Pit and the Pendulum.
These early lies were continued in the mid-1800s by Protestant writers, and we've inherited these same myths and prejudices today from grammar school history classes on up. You see, the Protestant authors really only wanted to attack the Catholic Church and not Spain. So they took advantage of the myths and lies about the Spanish Inquisition and just redirected them from a mainly anti-Spanish focus to an anti-Catholic one. It eventually became chic for liberated, nose-in-the-air, and enlightened modern men to hold in a dignified horror the base atrocities committed by fanatical papists several hundred years earlier. Of course, now, after decades of having mainstream culture caving into the myths and lies, Muslims, Jews are loudly protesting the supposedly gross cruelties committed against them during the Inquisition. It's ridiculous to hold on to all these lies about the Inquisition, just like it's ridiculous for people to bash the Spanish for taking back their lands that had been stolen from them by the Muslims in the first place. I mean, after all, the poor Muslims had only peacefully conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula and lovingly slaughtered, burned, and raped entire towns. So, the next time you're having lunch with co-workers or holiday or family dinners with your anti-Catholic family members or friends, what are you going to say when someone brings up the Inquisition? Well, here's a few points you want to remember. Number one, there were a lot of local inquisitions that tried baptized Catholics for grave sins against their faith. Number two, the Inquisitions introduced a new and much more just legal structure that our own court system has actually borrowed from. And point number three, the Spanish monarchy used the Inquisition to protect its national security at a time when it was in great danger from Muslim aggression. Remember, just like in Anglican England and Lutheran Germany, Catholic Spain saw religion as inseparable from patriotism and loyalty to the crown. Catholic monarchs saw religious belief as protecting the political stability of the country because they knew that their stability relied on the bedrock of natural law, established by God and delivered to them by Christ and His Catholic Church. As we've seen, it's clear that there is a huge amount of misinformation that was purposefully spread among the public to twist popular opinion against the Catholic Church. But now you know the truth and understand the arguments about the Inquisition. So you're now armed with the real facts needed to combat the nefarious assaults that people love to hurl against the Catholic Church. The ultimate thing to take away from all of this is that you should always cherish your faith, love the Church, and never cease to work to spread her message to the world. For the faith is our pearl of great price, our life, and our hope. So now you know. Thanks for watching this edition of CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. I'm Michael Voris. Let's hit the streets.